Hey up folks. Now you may recall recently I did a video about Molly Leigh, where I used my terrible voice acting skills to bring to life a 200-year-old conversation between two blokes in the Turk's Head pub in Burslem. If you've no idea what I'm talking about, I'll put a link to that video on the screen now. I'd recommend you go watch it first so you'll have a better idea of what I'm talking about in this video. You don't need to watch it all, but at least say watch the first bit, which is the conversation itself. So why do I mention it? Well, I'd like to revisit that conversation today because I received some interesting feedback on that video. Most of it was quite positive, people enjoyed it and found it interesting, but I was inundated with at least sort of 7 comments from people on various platforms, and some of the feedback was not so positive, but I thought some of the criticisms were actually quite interesting, so I'd like to take a closer look at that feedback and maybe answer a few of the questions. The other reason I wanted to bring it up again was that I touched on the source material in that video, but I touched on it right at the end, and that's the bit that YouTube tells me nobody's watched, so maybe people aren't actually aware of it. But the source material's actually really interesting, so I'd like to take a closer look at it and maybe bring it more to people's attention. I probably won't do all of that in this video, but I might well do a bit more of a deep dive into it in future videos if anyone's interested. And if nobody is, I'll probably do it anyway, to be honest, because I find it interesting. And I'm a bit sad like that, you know. Now, I don't have much of a script for this video, so it's probably going to be me talking for the most of it. I don't have any sort of fancy animations prepared or anything like that. It's probably going to be a bit more podcasty, which is something I've never really done before, so this is going to be interesting. You might have to bear with me in places. So what was this not so flattering feedback that I received on the Molly Leigh video? Well, it was mainly along the lines of, "That sounds nothing like a Stoke accent. What a load of drivel. If you're a real Stokie, I'm a monkey's uncle." That sort of thing, you know. Now this was specifically referring to the voice acting on that video rather than the sort of modern Potteries dialect that I've got in my other videos. I'm sure there'll be plenty of critics for that too, but we'll stick to this video for now. So what did I want to say about this feedback? Well, actually, I fully agree with it. It absolutely doesn't sound like a modern Stoke accent. In fact, I felt much the same when I was reading it, or rather trying to decipher it when I was researching for the video. I had to read certain sections of it over and over to grasp the sort of full pronunciation, and I did several takes of certain sections of it before I realised I was actually pronouncing it completely wrong, or I wasn't quite getting the message across from it, or not quite translating it correctly. It was quite a frustrating process actually, just as I thought I was done, I'd listen to it back again, and then a light bulb would come on at a certain point and think, hang on, that doesn't sound right, I might have to re-record that bit. And I went over and over that process until I finally got something like a good take towards the end. That and the fact that I've never done any sort of voice acting in the past, or never tried to attempt to do different voices and all that sort of thing made it really quite difficult. But it was an enjoyable challenge nonetheless. I'd like to do a bit more of it in future if I can find any suitable material, and if anyone can bear to listen to it again. So to the point of this video then. If I'm such an expert on Potteries dialect, why did I find it so hard then? It should have come as second nature, surely. Well, a few things to say on that point. Obviously, I don't speak Potteries dialect as my first language. In fact, I wouldn't have anyone to speak it to these days. Pretty much everyone I learnt my Potteries dialect from has passed away a long time ago. In fact, one of the blokes would have celebrated his 100th birthday last year if he was still with us. And obviously those people who I learned from all grew up in the 20th century, mostly born in the 1920s and 1930s, when Stoke-on-Trent was a teeming industrial city and an industrial powerhouse. So we'll see that the landscape that I learnt my Potteries dialect in was quite different from the one in the conversation. I suppose now would be a good time to touch on the original source material for the conversation, to give a bit more context. The source of the transcript of the conversation was a book published in 1843 by a man named John Ward, and it had the very catchy title of The Borough of Stoke-on-Trent in the Commencement of the Reign of Her Most Gracious Majesty Queen Victoria. I spend absolutely ages coming up with catchy titles for my YouTube videos, and that bloke just pulls that out of the hat. It was a simpler time back then. Definitely wouldn't get a good vidIQ score for that one. Anyway, where was I? So the book's a very thorough examination of the area in and around Stoke-upon-Trent at the time. Stoke-upon-Trent being the town of Stoke, which is now one of the 6 towns of Stoke-on-Trent. Actually not the city centre, which confuses a lot of people. The bit about Burslem, from which the conversation's taken, is just a small part of it. It's actually quite a really long and very thorough book. It also includes a lot of research and sort of statistics of mortality rates and all that sort of thing over time, so you can see how the area of the potteries grew up. You can see its transformation from sort of 6 small towns into one teeming city, and the impact of the Industrial Revolutions. The book's actually available as an ebook on Google Books. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go and read it. It is quite long, I'll warn you, and it's quite, it's written in quite oldie, sort of formal Victorian English. So it's not the most entertaining read, really. But it is interesting if you like that sort of thing. The chapter we're going to focus on is the one about Burslem, and more specifically, a full transcript of a conversation that was recorded in 1810. Not by John Ward, as far as I'm aware, but certainly John Ward was aware of it and he was able to procure it for this book, and it is recorded in the original dialect. Now, the basic premise of the conversation is just 2 blokes meet in Burslem marketplace and just have a bit of a chat, then they decide to go to the pub, and they start talking about old times, basically. They start talking about quite a range of different topics. The bit that I transcribed and the bit that I acted out was just a small chunk of it, and it isn't all just about Molly Leigh. The Molly Leigh story comes up, incidentally, because one of the people in the conversation, Rafe Leigh, was actually her cousin, and he actually witnessed her burial, which is a really unique account of what became a popular story in the area. Now, as I mentioned, the conversation was recorded as taking place in 1810, and the 2 blokes talking, Rafe Leigh and a man named John Tellwright, were actually over 80 years old at the time by their reckoning. That would place a good chunk of their adult life in Burslem before industry in the town really took off. And over that time they would have seen, in their lifetime, Burslem growing from a small market town on the edge of the Staffordshire moorlands to the prototype of the mother town that it had been referred to in later years. That's perhaps reflected by the baptism and burial records of the period. You can see how they grew exponentially over the period from the early 1700s to the sort of mid-1800s. Reflecting the population explosion that happened during the Industrial Revolution. So what we've actually got is quite a unique snapshot of what Burslem was like before industry really took off, harkening back to the days when it was a more rural sort of town. In fact, it'd be quite inaccurate to refer to the area as the Potteries at the point that Rafe and John Tellwright were born. Indeed, John Ward tells us that the area of Burslem in the sort of early 1700s was a bit of an eyesore. That was mainly because the pottery industry was still quite ad hoc at that time, so there were potters working, but many of them dug their own clay pits and that sort of thing, so like the centre of Burslem was sort of a marl of holes in the ground and crude smoky workshops. There wasn't really any supply chain sort of set up at that point or any kind of organised industry. We're talking before Wedgwood came around and founded his company in 1759. Rafe and John Tellwright would have been grown men at that point. And this was way before the canals arrived to kickstart the area's expansion. And it would take even longer for the pottery industry to grow into the mass-producing behemoth that it would become in the late Victorian era. In his early days, Wedgwood mainly catered to the aristocracy and focused on selling to a small and very exclusive audience, mainly in London. In fact, the 2 blokes actually touch on that topic earlier on in the conversation, which might be a good thing for another episode at some point. So it isn't that surprising then that the dialect depicted actually sounds a lot different to modern Potteries dialect. In fact, John Ward doesn't actually refer to it as Potteries dialect in the book. He refers to it as Old North Staffordshire or Old Moorland dialect, which reflects its more sort of rural nature. So that was a very long and convoluted way of saying that it doesn't sound like Potteries dialect, because in truth it isn't. Potteries dialect wasn't really a thing at that point. Obviously since then, in the 200 years after that conversation took place, Stoke-on-Trent has expanded exponentially, becoming a massive industrial powerhouse in the early 20th century and then subsequently declining into the city that it is today. So its landscape's changed quite a lot since then. And obviously the massive population explosion wasn't just catered by expanding birth rates and that sort of thing. It was also migration from more urban areas. So a lot of people migrated to cities in that time, bringing with them their own sort of local dialects and their own sort of local lingo and accent. So the modern Potteries dialect is probably a bit of a melting pot in that sense. And what we're looking at here is something before that expansion took place. There's also one final reason that I found it difficult. And it's mainly the way it's written down. So it's written in a sort of phonetic form of English, but a very posh sort of phonetic form of English. In places it felt a bit like that language you see at the top of Wikipedia articles, where it tries to tell you how you pronounce like an Eastern European scientist's name or something like that. So it's got a few strange punctuation marks and that sort of thing. These days when you write Potteries dialect, like I do in most of my other videos, that you'll be familiar with, assuming you've watched any of them, of course, and I highly recommend that you do. The more modern sort of convention is to write in sort of modern phonetic English, so we basically write the way we speak. But the language written down in the conversation is sort of an old, more formal sort of phonetic way, so it's got a few odd punctuation marks and a few odd diphthongs and that sort of thing, which took a bit of getting used to. It's also got a lot of footnotes as well to try and explain what it's talking about, so it was quite a broken process to try and get something fluent together. So I'm going to leave it off there, and I'm going to thank you all for listening to me ramble for a good 10 minutes on this podcast. Well, / episode, whatever you want to call it. Do intend to do a few more of these and have a bit more of a deep dive into the conversation itself, so I hope you'll join me for those. Until then, ta very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.